The Sikh Human Rights Group proudly presents our Neurodiversity speaker series. Today's topic, why the employment rate is so low in the United Kingdom for those who possess autism and what we can do to redress this. Today you'll be listening to Dr Luke Beardon, a senior lecturer at Sheffield Hallam University. Luke has worked for several years in the field of autism and Asperger Syndrome, in capacities ranging from practitioner to researcher to trainer. He started work specific to autism for the National Autistic Society as a service coordinator assisting in the development of a residential service for young adults with autism. In his post as senior lecturer in autism, Luke runs various courses at different academic levels in autism, including a master's qualification, while continuing to research and consult in the field of autism. He is the course leader for the Postgraduate Certificate in Asperger Syndrome, run in collaboration with the National Autistic Society, and supervises students at doctoral level. In 2011, he was nominated for and subsequently awarded the Inspirational Teacher Award as voted by students. In 2012, Luke was nominated for and subsequently awarded the Inspirational Research Supervisor Award as well as voted by students. In addition, Luke has been part of a research team at Nottingham University, run a 3-year project and has several publications in national and international journals related to his projects. He completed his doctoral thesis at Sheffield Hallam University, which was entitled Asperger Syndrome and a Perceived Offending Conduct, a Qualitative Study. He co-wrote the Aspect Consultancy Report, the largest consultation with adults with ASD undertaken at the time. He is the co-editor of 3 books on Asperger Syndrome published by Jessica Kingsley and has various other publications in journals. Welcome, Luke, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Hi.
Hi, Luke. Luke, could I please ask you to begin by telling our audience a little bit about your experiences or understanding of the factors behind the low employment rate in the United Kingdom for those with autism?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, thanks for inviting me. I ought to start off just with a very brief section on terminology that I intend to use, just to make it crystal clear for all of your viewers stroke listeners. I tend to use identity first language, so autistic person rather than person with autism. I know people have differing preferences, but my views just align with the majority of the autistic population, as is recorded through research. I also no longer use the term Asperger syndrome. In fact, I'm currently changing the names of my books to take that term away. There are a whole number of different reasons for that, which perhaps today isn't the day to go through those, but mostly in line with the fact that I reject sort of the notion of severity and differing typologies of autism. I think autism is autism per se, and that's it. So I no longer use reference to the term Asperger syndrome. In terms of employment, one of the things that always fascinates me is the various statistics around employment levels. Now, don't get me wrong, I absolutely advocate for the fact that we aren't, advocate for an understanding of the fact that we as a society are not doing what we should be doing to support autistic people in employment. That is categorical as far as I'm concerned. It's irrefutable, the fact that autistic people are at a disadvantage when it comes to being employed, often at a significant disadvantage, I would suggest. However, what we don't know accurately is how many autistic people are actually in employment. There are various statistics, and there is some research around how many autistic people are in employment. But what we actually mean by those statistics are how many people who have an autism identification, who are willing to disclose that, who are part of the population that are being researched. And all 3 of those areas are up for debate. So one thing that we do know, for example, is that within the UK, we under-identify, so what people would regard as diagnosis, I tend to reframe as identification. We under-identify autistic adults. We know that. We know that there are huge waiting lists for people wanting that identification who don't yet have it. So there's a question mark then over, are they included in those statistics around employment? And if the answer is no, then that muddies the waters in terms of real terms, real statistics in terms of how many people are employed. I suspect that the figures that are between sort of 10 and 15% of autistic people who are in employment are probably about right, but it's worth just identifying those facts. It may be significantly higher, it may be significantly lower. What we don't know is an accurate figure. But going back to the main point in terms of disadvantage, and that's what we need to be addressing or redressing. So I think it's a fairly simple notion that if the majority of practice, including employment practice, from putting adverts out all the way through to a retirement party and everything in between, if those practices are deemed to be best practice or good practice for most people, what we actually mean is they're good practice for what I regard as the predominant neurotype. So what many people will regard as the non-autistic population or the non-neurodivergent population. So within neurodiversity, you'll have all sorts of neurodivergent populations, including autism. So my reference to the predominant neurotype are people who wouldn't come under that bracket of neurodivergence. But of course, everybody is part of neurodiversity. So if good practice is for the predominant neurotype, then by definition, there is a higher risk if you are neurodivergent of that practice not being suitable for you, which then puts you at a disadvantage. And I very much advocate for an understanding that most practice within most employment is for the predominant neurotype and not for the autistic individual, which increases risk of disadvantage and therefore increases risk of lack of or poor employment practice. So I think we are currently in a position where we've got a long way to go to counterbalance that disadvantage and create equality and equity when it comes to employment practice for autistic individuals.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was extremely thorough and interesting. Following on from that, my next question is, it's quite general, but what are the greatest challenges and issues associated with those with autism finding, obtaining and retaining employment in the current UK market?
A general question. I could give you a general answer and just say pretty much everything, but I suspect that that won't sit too well for your audience and would be somewhat flippant of me. But if we do go through everything from how we recruit individuals all the way through to that retirement party, we could argue that everything needs at least attention and potentially the need for change. So, for example, if there is only one singular way of applying for a job, then I would suspect that puts many autistic people at a disadvantage. There's a fairly simple equation, I think, which I would suggest is something along the lines of the fewer the choices available to any population, in this case, the autistic population, then there's an increased risk of being at a disadvantage around access. So for taking the application form, for example, if there's only one way to apply for a job and that one way suits most people, if by definition you're not part of that most people, i.e. there's a demographic norm and as an autistic person, you're in a minority group, then the lack of choice then puts you at a disadvantage. If, on the other hand, an employer thinks, okay, well, we want to be neurodivergent affirmative, which is a great phrase, or autism affirmative, which is a great phrase, they might say, okay, well, we recognize that going onto this website, downloading this application form, filling it in electronically and sending it back might only suit 80% of the population. There's another 20% that might see that and think, okay, well, that is not how my brain works. I'm much better at ... And proactively recognizing that, an employer might suggest, okay, there are a number of ways that you can apply for this job. including filling in this application form, downloading it, filling it in and sending it back electronically. Or, and we recognise that that's going to take us 12 minutes to read through. So to make it fair and to make it applicable to us as employees or potential employers, we haven't got all the time in the world. So we'll say, okay, well, every application process takes 12 minutes. How about you send us a 12-minute video, screencast, vlog, whatever you want to do, of why you think you meet the criteria that we set out. Or there's a CV that needs to be X number of words or less, so that comes within the 12-minute criterion. Or it might be that you can get somebody to interview you over a 12-minute period, asking you questions about why you might think you might be good for this job, and you audio record that and you send that to us as an audible recording, etc., etc., etc. There are a plethora of different ways of how individual might impart knowledge and expertise that go beyond just filling in a form. And if you might say, if they only all take 12 minutes, then that's fair and equitable. Why would we not go down the route of as much choice as possible, which then reduces risk of disadvantage? That's just the application stage. When it comes to the next stage, which is traditionally the interview, again, it might be that we recognize that for some autistic people, an interview might put them off applying for the job, full stop. They might be the best person in the world for doing the actual job, and they might be the worst person in the world at being interviewed. So we need to recognize that there's a mismatch between interviewing somebody and a person's ability to do a job. After all, being interviewed is very much a situation that involves all sorts of skills that might not necessarily be the same sorts of skills that are required to do the actual job. So it's always mystified me why there's this almost immediate supposition that we interview people and subsequently make the erroneous assumption that being good at interview equates to being good at doing a job. So it might be that we suggest, okay, there are other ways of ascertaining whether or not somebody is good for a job. And again, that decreases the risk of disadvantage. Now, if you break down employment throughout in that sort of way, all the way through to the retirement party, and an autistic person may very much want to have a retirement party, but very much not want to be present at it, so everybody else can enjoy a celebration while the autistic person goes and sits at home happily retired, and we make those adaptations all the way through, then it's much more likely we'll have an increase in happy autistic employees. And it goes further than that. Even job descriptions themselves these days, and it might be that we revisit this later on in the chat, but job descriptions tend to be very generic. You need to be a good communicator. Rhetorical question, what does that even mean? What does, in this day and age, does that mean you're an absolute expert at engaging on Zoom? Does that mean you're an absolute expert at chatting in a room with 3 other people? Does that mean you're an expert at answering the phone? They're all completely different skills. And it might be that you're really good at one of those skills and not so good at some of the others. So again, those sorts of job descriptions need to be honed to reflect the actual job, as opposed to these sorts of very generic situations that often autistic people might struggle with.
Thank you very much, Luke. I think what you said previously about the applications themselves, and they apply to higher educational institutions as well, and applying for university or for a sixth form college, and there's a lot to be taken from that, but I'll let our audience draw their own conclusions, as it were. Moving on, my next question to you is, what role does individuality have in the workplace? For example, how does this affect the manner in which employers respond or should respond to employing those with autism?
I guess it depends very much on the job itself. There are some jobs, I'm guessing, I'm not an expert in employment, but there are some jobs whereby that sort of individuality might be preclusive to engaging in doing the job well. There are other jobs, for example, there's an advert on at the moment for a specific airline. I don't know if I'm allowed to say who they are, but there's an airline and there's an advert for it that screams individuality, and they're using it as a selling point. Look at our way of doing it. It's very individual. It's very much about the person. I think within certain roles, and you only have to look at some very, very successful, usually self-employed entrepreneurs who do things very much their own way, who are incredibly successful. Now, actually, that's a really important point, because they do tend to be entrepreneurs, they do tend to be self-employed. So the question is, well, how come nobody else snapped them up? And actually, if you talk to those sorts of individuals, they will say themselves, and I know because I've spoken to some of them, I'm not saying all of them will say this, but certainly some of them will say, well, we felt that we wouldn't be any good at coming across in an interview, or we were too individual to be part of this company. We felt that we would be rejected by the institution because we were too individual. So we embarked and did our own thing and ended up highly successful as a result. So the question needs to be flipped around and say, well, why aren't we engaging and embracing that individuality? The thing about individuality means, by definition, you have the ability to do things in slightly different ways to everybody else. And you have to do things slightly differently in order to have growth. That goes throughout evolution, society, general practice, all of those sorts of things. Stagnation is not good for the economy. Stagnation is not usually good for employment. So I think we need that juxtaposition of individuals who are able to have that continuous, steady, this is the norm, this is how we do things, alongside individuals who have a different way of thinking, a different way of doing things, and are able to bring about those sorts of change that might be beneficial for the employer. So I think individuality is something absolutely to be embraced, accepted, and enjoyed and benefited from. But if we are going to go down the route of fully accepting and have equity around individuality, then there needs to be more individuality, if you like, around how we actually employ people in the first place.
Thank you very much, Luke. And of course, you're completely right. If I could just build upon the question, I was also referring to the fact that a lot of employers are currently, they have blanket policies to deal with neurodiverse individuals. So to give you an example, I was speaking to a practitioner the other day, and they had a case study for us, which was a young girl with autism was employed, she was onboarded, and the ordinary process is there's 4 departments for every 6 months to be moved around those different departments, being customer service, customer complaints, so on and so forth. But now, because of her autism, the company in question decided that what was in her best interest was for her to be given a singular desk in a single department, and for her to be retained there and not to move along with her new colleagues. Now, the issue really was that the issue arose was the fact that she would have been perfectly happy moving around the 4 different departments with her new onboarding colleagues, or new starters, as it were. But the employer just couldn't quite see that. And so my question really is, do you believe that blanket policies in businesses can achieve the same results, or do you think it's very much has to be focused on the individual's wants and needs?
100% the latter. You need to start off with a recognition that there's a high likelihood of needing for things to be different for one's neurodivergent employees. So that might be a blanket policy. It's not necessarily a policy. I think it's probably more an ethos, a culture, a vein or strand running through everything. So at the forefront of everybody's minds is, when we are engaging with our neurodivergent employees, we need to potentially think about doing things differently, not automatically, but potentially. So we need to second guess. We need to always be thinking, do we need to do something slightly differently? So that might be a cultural ethos throughout the whole of the company or the institution or whatever. In terms of what that practice might look like, we don't know until we meet the individual. And also, we don't know until we re-engage with that individual tomorrow and next week and the year after, because people's needs will change over time. So I'll give you an example. You gave a really good example there. I'll give you another example. You might have an individual. So the blanket policy, if you like, might be every autistic employee we will support to have a sensory profile. So we understand what that individual's sensory needs are within the workplace. Subsequently, we will do a sensory audit in her environment, and we will match and make sure that the sensory environment suits her sensory profile. That would be a sort of blanket policy in terms of everybody has the offer of a sensory profile and a sensory audit, and then you make it individual to each specific person. But that is subsequently reviewed every time the environment changes. So the person moves offices or they go to a different environment, we redo the sensory profile and we redo the sensory audit. Even if the individual stays in the same environment, we will have an ongoing updating of the sensory profile, because people's sensory needs may change over time as part of their own sensory profile, but also as slight differences within the sensory environment. So say, for example, somebody gets a new computer who's sat 6 meters across the way. That might be a change in the sensory environment that needs adaptation based on the individual's sensory profile. It might be that there's a new fire alarm installed. It might be that we get a new phone that makes a different type of noise, or whatever it might be. So the blanket policy, if you like, or the ethos is we need to understand individuals' sensory needs, and that's just one component of neurodivergence, obviously. And the individuality is, okay, this is how we engage with this individual around this particular area to make sure that everybody's on a level playing field. Now, if you did that with everything that relates to being an autistic individual, then all of a sudden you may end up with a brilliant employee who might otherwise have really struggled within the employment environment. So it's well worth doing. It might seem like a lot of work. A, it's the morally right thing to do. B, if you do it, you're going to end up with a much happier and contented employee, which again is not just your moral and ethical duty, but your legal, it's a legal duty as well. But C, from a business point of view, it makes a lot of sense, because you'll end up with much happier, much more productive employees who you may retain for longer periods of time. So it kind of makes sense for everybody, I think.
I couldn't agree more. And just for the employers listening, are there third-party companies that offer these sensory profile services that can come into your business? And you may have onboarded neurodiverse individuals over the past 10 years. You haven't conducted a sensory profile. Are there companies out there in the United Kingdom that are willing to offer these services to you as an employer, in your professional understanding?
Yeah, absolutely, there are. I mean, usually they stem from the professionals within occupational therapy fields, not exclusively, but usually. And there are autism specific employment specialists who might come in and do an entire autism audit, not just a sensory audit. I'm not necessarily saying they're easy to access, but they do exist. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, if you like, in that if people are not making use of these services, then they'll remain small in stature. The more people demand, the greater the supply will become, and that can only be a good thing as long as quality remains high as well. And of course, the best people usually to do those sorts of coming in and doing an audit around what adjustments might be required are very often autistic adults themselves. Not exclusively, but very, very often. And again, that then only increases employed autistic people. So if we increase the demand for autistic adults to be employed to do audits for other autistic adults to be in employment, then it's a win-win situation all round.
Thank you very much, Luke. So moving on to my next question, we have touched upon it previously, and we did speak very briefly about the unreliability of the statistics currently on offer for the rate of employment. So speaking more generally, in 2021, the United Kingdom's Office for National Statistics found that those with severe or specific learning difficulties, autism and mental illnesses or other nervous disorders were least likely to be in work than any other disabled group. So therefore, in your professional opinion, question, what should we be doing on both an individual and a societal level to redress this? On the individual side of things, we're looking at more at people who, your cohorts of other employees, what you can be doing from, an individual standpoint within the business, and then more societal, we're looking at, national legislators and so on and so forth. Over to you, Luke.
Sort of moving backwards, if you like, because that's probably the easiest way of doing it. At a national level, we have got the equality duty, and autism comes under the protected characteristics of the Equality Act. So I wonder sometimes. I really like the Equality Act. I think it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes I've heard people being quite down on the Equality Act. I don't think that's the fault, if you like, of the Act itself. I think that the problem arises when people aren't following the Equality Act. So I think at a organisational or societal level, we need to be much better at understanding what our legal duty actually is, in terms of making reasonable adjustments and what those reasonable adjustments should actually look like. I think we're only in the infancy of understanding what reasonable adjustments at that individual level might even look like. So there is still far too often more sort of generic ways. It goes back, actually, I meant to mention this, one of your earlier questions about should people make reasonable adjustments. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing what your question was, but it was about the autistic woman in 4 different departments. Should there be autism good practice within an institution? And the answer is, well, yes, of course, we want good autism practice. What does that look like? We don't know until we engage with the autistic individual, him, her, or their self. The idea that there is generic autism good practice, I think, actually could create its own problems, because what might be brilliant practice for one autistic person might be an absolute employment nightmare for somebody else. So recognizing the level of individuality that's required within the neurodivergent population is absolutely essential. So people need to take responsibility for understanding the Act, and then subsequently understanding that the Act only really works when applied very specifically to one specific person. So we can do generic things like having wider choices around communication, wider choices around how we involve somebody around recruiting. We can have greater choice in terms of what a job description might look like to reflect the actual job as opposed to very generic skills, all of those sorts of things. But when it comes to individual reasonable adjustments, there's no such thing as an autism reasonable adjustment per se. It needs to be done very much on that individual level. In terms of sort of going more to the micro rather than the macro, it's all about understanding and accepting the autistic individual. It's categorically not about autism awareness. I'm not a fan at all of this concept we need to be aware of autistic people. Everybody is aware of autistic people. What does it even mean to be aware? Autism understanding, autism skills, autism acceptance, autism knowledge, the ability to have genuine knowledge as opposed to a little bit of generic knowledge that you then apply to everybody, which again is a very dangerous road to go down. So I suppose it would be remiss of me not to answer by saying everybody come on my postgraduate certificate and then subsequently the full masters at Sheffield Hallam University. And we do have people that do come on those courses. In fact, my very first successful PhD student came on my postgraduate certificate specifically because he was line managing an autistic woman and he wanted to find out more about it. He subsequently did the postgraduate certificate, completed that, then completed the masters, and then did a PhD with me. So he went the full hog, really, if you like. I'm not expecting all of your people listening to this who are employers to go down that route, but wouldn't it be amazing if every employer said we're going to have a neurodivergent champion, and that neurodivergent champion, so somebody who's going to be championing what we need to do. So it's not a case of every single person within the institution needs to be an autism expert, but we do have somebody that we always have within our institution who is that autism expert, and we will pay for that person to go on a postgraduate certificate in autism or a master's in autism, preferably at Sheffield Hallam University, but other institutions are available. And actually, whether it's ironic or not, and I didn't do this because I knew I was coming on the podcast. I've had this in place for well over a decade. The second module of my postgraduate, I call it mine, I'm the course leader for the Postgraduate Certificate in Autism, is called Autism in Practice. And we get students to engage in what practice of their choice, and sometimes it is employment practice, and ascertain what would be the absolute gold standard best practice within their own institution, and then essentially do an audit to find out where they're at, so that by the end of the module, they've got, this is where we want to be in terms of absolute best practice, this is where we are now, and this is what needs to change. And that does lead, it has led in some cases, to absolutely effective change within employment. And I know that because those students have fed back to me subsequently the year after, or the year after that, or even 5 years down the line, to reflect on coming on the course, doing that particular module, and then affecting change within the workplace. And that's fantastic for me in terms of understanding that autism knowledge is being put into practice. There's no point in having autism knowledge if it doesn't get put into practice. So I think there's plenty of knowledge out there to tap into. It's a case of understanding one's moral, ethical and legal duty to do so, and then how you go about doing it. So I think on that individual level, it is very much about, okay, it's not just about autism awareness, it's about autism understanding. It's not just about autism understanding, it's about accepting absolutely who that individual is, what their needs are, and then our obligation in terms of meeting those needs. And you can only do that on that individual by individual basis.
Thank you very much, Luke. That was extremely thorough and interesting. My next question, now we've touched upon this in quite a lot of detail before, but I'll ask it nonetheless. And that is, how can employers ensure that their recruitment processes are made more accessible to those with autism? So maybe perhaps just some examples for employers who are looking to follow this up. One, idea that's always kind of been born in my mind is this notion of, instead of having interviews, allowing people to actually perform on-the-job interviews. So having the job description sent to them perhaps 2 weeks beforehand, this is how you perform the role, and then being allowed to practically perform that said role. Do you agree with that, or do you believe it should be something slightly different perhaps?
I think that's a great way of moving forward for everybody. One of the things that slightly frustrates me, really frustrates me, is the fact that if we make practice in general more autism friendly, it tends to suit everybody, and it tends to level the playing field as well. So, for example, if hypothetically we have to insist on an interview, and a reasonable adjustment might be, well, the autistic individual might require the questions for the interview a week before. Give everybody the questions a week before. It doesn't matter. It's good practice for everybody. And again, it just levels the playing field. A long time ago, I was lucky enough to be involved in a working party for the government around employment. And all of the autistic individuals who were involved in advising in terms of how we move forward around, specifically around recruitment, said, just let us do the job. And gauge how good we are at doing it by us actually doing it. And if we're no good, don't employ us. And if we are good, then employ us. As simple as that. Now, pragmatically, that isn't always possible, depending on what the job is and how many people are applying for the job and so on and so forth. But actually having that as part and parcel of the recruitment process seems to me to be a fantastic idea. Absolutely. I think being an autism affirmative employer from the outset and proactively pushing that and saying, look, we're proud to accept applications in whatever form from neurodivergent individuals will attract individuals' attention to that employer. But the employer needs to back that up with real practice as well. And I think those sort of proactive demonstration of understanding of neurodivergent needs can be very comforting to the neurodivergent individual. I'm thinking, actually, this might be something that I am actually willing to apply for, because don't underestimate the anxiety of applying for a job where you don't know if you're going to feel safe. or feel accepted or feel understood. So actually, the more we can do to make people feel safe, to feel accepted, to be understood right from the outset, and then back that up in real practice, then the more chance we'll have of increasing the number of autistic people actually applying for those roles in the first place. So I think there's all sorts of things we can do around that, including, as you mentioned earlier, having specific policies or having, statements around what an employer might suggest in terms of their neurodivergent affirmative stance, as long as that, as I say, as long as that's backed up in practice. So I think there's plenty that can be done. I know there's plenty that can be done. And I also know absolutely irrefutably that it does and can work.
Thank you very much, Luke. So moving the focus away now from employers and more towards neurodiverse individuals themselves, in your professional and academic understanding or experience, what support is currently available to those with autism who are currently seeking employment? And that really is just a question asking you for some advice if you are a neurodiverse individual sitting at home thinking, oh gosh, how can I get myself on the first rung of the ladder? What would be your advice to them?
I wish it was an easy question to answer. I wish I could just say, oh, contact this organisation or that organisation and job done. And that isn't the case. It should be the case, but it isn't. At the moment, the sort of generic support that's available to all unemployed people is, and I'm only saying this anecdotally, this is not based on research, but anecdotally that's reported back to me by autistic individuals who have tried to go down the generic route in terms of employment support agencies and so on. They will say, look, they just didn't understand my needs, they just didn't understand where I was coming from. They came back with the most ludicrous offers of what it was that I needed or what route I needed to take. So we need to be doing a lot more in terms of increasing the knowledge and the skills of the more generic support that is available to all unemployed individuals. But I think we also need to make it a lot fairer for autistic people across the country, or the world, around what is actually available. So at the moment it's very post-coded. You might be very, very lucky to have an autism specific charity that will take a referral, if you like, from yourself as a neurodivergent individual, autistic individual, to provide support around employment. And there are some of those at local levels. But at the moment, that isn't a service that is automatically available to everybody. So I think we need to do, well, three things, I think, because I like things in threes. One, increase the expertise of the generic services that are available. Two, increase the offer of specialist services so they're available to everybody who might require them. And three, increase the offer to the autistic individual themselves around having an understanding of how autism impacts on them. Now, that isn't meant in any way, shape or form in a kind of patronizing manner, but I think that we as a society are incredibly poor, firstly at identifying individuals in the first place, secondly at that post-identification support, and thirdly providing very real information and knowledge around how autism actually impacts on you as an individual. It tends to be very generic information. And my view is that the better, this goes for everybody, and my field obviously being autism, it's specifically toward autistic people, but actually includes everybody. The better understanding you have of your own self, the better chances you have of making choices that are opportune to you. So if you have a poor understanding of self, you tend to make choices that aren't necessarily good for you. If you're an autistic person, and you don't have a good understanding of what that actually means to you, then again, that increases chances of making choices that aren't necessarily good for you. And often making choices that might be applicable to the majority of individuals as opposed to you as an autistic person who then by definition is in a minority group. So I think doing those three things, it sounds very easy when you say it. Of course, in reality, it's much, much harder. But I think doing those three things in conjunction with one another will again only increase autism affirmative action and autism affirmative responses when it comes to employment.
That was excellent. Thank you very much. One of my final questions to you, Luke, is in your professional opinion, we can't have a podcast without mentioning this, but what are or can be the benefits of employing those with autism?
Um, I do know that people have written about how excellent autistic employees are. Um, and that's absolutely the case. I know plenty of autistic people in employment who frequently get awards and get plaudits for being absolutely superb at doing their job. And often they're those individuals who are allowed, in inverted commas, to actually do their job, as opposed to being pulled in all sorts of different directions, which wasn't what they signed up for in the first place. I think it's only fair to say that non-autistic people can also be excellent at their jobs. So I don't see it as a case of being autistic makes you brilliant at being an employee. But the reverse is also the case. Being autistic does not make you a poor employee. So my view is, if we support autistic people in the right way, in the right job, then the chances of them being absolutely superb, excellent, wonderful employees is very much the case. So I think there's absolutely a correlation between the offer of the role that we give to autistic people with the right support mechanisms or adjustments around them, with then subsequently those individuals being, the most valued member of your team. So I think, it all comes down to that individual understanding and adjustments around what a person might need, some of which may only be incredibly simple. So say, for example, I don't understand why meetings don't start on time, why meetings with an agenda don't follow the agenda, why meetings don't finish at a time that they're supposed to finish. And I've come across good autism practice whereby if there's a team meeting that is supposed to start at 9 o'clock, then the room is open from 8:30 for those people who want to come early and do that thing called social chit chat, which some might regard as an absolute waste of time, but actually it fulfills those individuals' needs so that at 9 o'clock we can start the meeting. So the person who might not want that social chit chat can come in at 1 minute to 9, sit down and get on with the meeting, and it's chaired properly so that all the agenda items are covered in the order in which they're on the schedule, and people are advised if they wanted to bring up anything else, they do so under any other business or in a different meeting. Now that's just good autism friendly practice that doesn't cost anything at all, and is very, very simple to implement. And people who might be unhappy at it to start off with soon get used to that sort of practice being common. So there's all sorts of things that we can do that literally cost nothing at all, that can also literally mean the difference between somebody being a happy employee or being homeless. So it's absolutely within our best interests to understand that even small changes to have that understanding and acceptance and recognition of autistic need can have an enormous impact, literally, on the trajectory of the real life of autistic people. And I know many people for whom employment has not worked out because of a lack of understanding, who have ended up literally homeless, as opposed to people who report back to me and say, well, because I was allowed to engage in this way, I'm now a successful employee, owning my own home with my own family. So the life paths can be extraordinarily different, and yet the effort that it takes to go one way rather than another are sometimes only very minimal.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. I had just an anecdote for you, but I was speaking to one of our Sikh Neurodiversity Network participants, and they recently obtained employment, and one of their biggest benefits from their employers was that at the end of meetings they were given action points, so because they felt they were getting lost in the broader discussion that was going on within the meeting, and they were leaving it feeling they weren't fulfilling the role as perhaps they should do. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that you agree with very small adjustments, which, as you said, can make the world of difference to neurodiverse individuals. My final question, Luke, and it's very, very broad. It just is there any other matter that you wish to discuss, and that can be kind of translated into what points would you like both employers and neurodiverse individuals to kind of take away from today's discussion? What would be your take-home message to those parties?
Don't be afraid of autism. Seriously. And don't be afraid to talk to autistic people. It amazes me sometimes. I used to do consultancy for the National Autistic Society when I was employed by them. A number of times you go into whatever it might be, organisation, service or whatever, and they say, oh, I've got this problem. And you say, okay, well, what's the autistic person got to say about it? And they say, oh, we haven't asked them. And it always used to amaze me. It's, why not just engage with the autistic person? And actually, it might sound a bit flippant, but also believe what they say. Autistic people, it's a complete misnomer, by the way, this concept. Autistic people cannot lie. Autistic people can lie. Most autistic people find it very difficult to lie and actually, tend to be a lot more truthful than the predominant neurotype, but it's not as binary or black and white as no autistic people can ever tell a lie. However, it stuns me how little we often listen and accept what autistic people say. Autistic people don't make things up. They don't say, oh, I literally cannot work in an open plan office in a productive manner. And then people say, oh, well, you want special treatment. Well, no, it's not that I want special treatment. I'm telling you, if you want me to be productive, I cannot operate successfully in an open plan office. Why would that person be making that up? Like literally, why would that person be making it up? And actually, if all you need to do is put a partition in or give that person their own space or allow that person to work from home, and all of a sudden their productivity goes up, why would you not do that? And this idea then that, well, everybody wants so-called preferential treatment. It's not preferential treatment. It's a requirement. In the same way that a left-handed person might say, I need to have the phone on the left-hand side of my desk rather than, or whatever it might be, or the dyslexic person saying, okay, can you please just translate this for me? Or if I'm typing an email, it's a blanket policy that any email that I send, nobody picks me up for my spelling and grammar because that's just how I write. Or whatever it might be. It's not preferential, it's a requirement. And actually, if other people in the office are then saying, well, actually, I would work more productively without being in an open plan office, take that into account as well. Actually listening to employees who are neurodivergent and who are non-neurodivergent is actually a useful thing to do. And again, autistic people aren't making these things up. And actually understanding the difference between preferential treatment and what is genuinely required is a huge distinction and an important one to make. So I do think, come on my course. That would be the open invitation. You do have to pay for it, unfortunately. But yeah, here's one for you. University courses might appear to be expensive, but actually a lot of them, in the great scheme of things in terms of employment, rather than saying, okay, we're going to have intense training for every single employee every single time they come and go, as opposed to this idea of having smaller strands of absolute expertise. So this concept of an autism champion or a group of autism champions who may well be your autistic employees in the first place. I think that's a brilliant way forward. I think that as long as the rest of the institution respects and understands that actually when they say that this needs to change, then we need to take that we need to take that genuinely into consideration. So I think there's plenty of, I think it's pessimistic, going back to what you were saying right at the beginning, in terms of, okay, well, we're clearly not doing things in the right way. But I like to flip that around, saying because we're not doing things in the right way, there's loads we can do to change and make life better. So I think as long as we take that optimistic view and run with it, then the world could become what I call autopia, autistic utopia for the future. And if we have that concept of autopia and always consistently, continually work towards it, then that can only be a good thing.
Thank you so much, Luke, for taking the time out of what I know is an extremely busy schedule to be with us. It's been wonderful having you on. I only have a few concluding remarks, and that is this podcast has been brought to you by the Sikh Human Rights Group. For more information about Dr. Luke Beardon or the Sikh Human Rights Group's policies, please visit our website, the link to which can be found within the description to this video, or alternatively, please visit our social media accounts at SHRG_NGO. I've been Class Arbuthnot. Thank you very much for listening.